Thank you all so much for joining our ocean restoration panel as we're just getting set up here. And thrilled to begin, and thank you for joining the Marketplace for the Future event. And I hope it's been as unique and exciting for you all as it's been for us. This wonderful new way to connect in a virtual world. Hopefully it feels a little bit more real and engaging, and you know, you have the opportunity to foster those connections and conversations. So today, in this session, we'll be talking about ocean restoration, what that means, best practices to accomplish that, and featuring specifically these individuals, entrepreneurs, and nonprofits on this session, and sharing the work that they're doing within this realm, what they've been learning, and how we can be optimistic for a brighter future. I think as we are sitting at the culmination or towards the end of Climate Week, you know, it's a really challenging and time with a lot of tension and there are a lot of reasons to feel disenchanted with the world. But at the same time, I think it's so important for us to remind ourselves why we're optimistic and why we keep on fighting and collaborating and working together. And so I hope that this panel can share some of that optimism and positivity with all of you. So a little bit, before we dive in, I'll just share a little bit of background on Oceanic Global and then leave it to our panelists to introduce themselves. So I'm Cassia Patel, the program director at Oceanic Global, and we are a nonprofit that engages new audiences in ocean conservation. So really looking to go beyond our silos of environmental communities and engage with people who may or may not identify as environmentalists, and tapping into music, art, fashion, sports, immersive technologies like this one, to speak to people and weave in environmental messaging where they're already engaged. And we really focus on behavior change at both the individual and the industry level. At the individual level, we have a grassroots program and a regional hubs program with hubs in New York City, the Hamptons, LA, London, and Barcelona. So if you're in any of those regions, please do reach out to get involved. And on the industry side, we focus more on engaging businesses through our program, the Oceanic Standard, working with businesses from the hospitality sector, restaurants, hotels, but also with music festivals and stadiums and office spaces to help them tackle their plastic and their waste. And we'll speak about this briefly as we continue the discussion here, but eliminating plastic and waste is actually another way that we can restore our coastlines and restore our ocean by reducing the pollutants that are entering it. So without further ado, I'd love for our panelists to introduce themselves and to share more about who they are and who they're representing today. Kelsey, would you like to start us off here?
Great, thank you, Akwe Winkasek. So hello, welcome everyone. My name is Dr. Kelsey Leonard. I'm an assistant professor in the Faculty of Environment at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada, and also serve on behalf of my nation, the Shinnecock Nation. I introduce myself in our Shinnecock language. For the Mid-Atlantic Committee on the Ocean. So formerly, those were our regional planning bodies under the U.S. National Ocean Council, which we'll talk more about in terms of the evolution. But we are now called MACO, the Mid-Atlantic Committee on the Ocean. So I'm really happy to be here with everyone, and thanks so much for the introduction.
Fantastic. Jason, do you want to go next?
Yeah, thank you so much. My name is Jason Donofrio. I'm the External Relations Officer for the Ocean Foundation. We are the only community foundation exclusively devoted to the ocean and coastal communities. We were created in 2002, and while we're headquartered in Washington, D.C., we are very international in presence. So we operate in more than 25 different countries on all 7 continents, and we host over 50 different projects that span the gambit of different areas of marine conservation, everything from working with particular species and particular fields to working with indigenous communities and coastal communities. So very, very grateful to Cassia and to Marketplace of the Future for allowing our ocean organization to participate during Climate Week. And we always love to have ocean and climate be part of the same conversation. So I look forward to it. Thank you.
Awesome. And Sam, you want to bring us home?
All right, thanks, Cassia. Thanks to my other panelists for being here. I'm excited to learn about your work. I'm also taking more of a relaxed position just because I recently got knee surgery. So I hope everyone else is comfortable out there. My name is Sam Teicher. I am the co-founder and chief reef officer of Coral Vita, which is a social enterprise that grows coral to restore dying reefs. I've been a diver since I was a kid. I love the ocean more than most things. And that's enough for me. But ultimately, I think everyone kind of recognizes that often the ecological case isn't enough to really get actors to do what's right and what's necessary to protect the planet. And at the end of the day, coral reefs are really valuable. They sustain up to 1 billion people around the world in over 100 nations, while generating $30 billion a year through tourism and fisheries and coastal protection. But half the world's reefs are dead, and we're on track to lose over 90% in the next 30 years. And so what we're doing at Coral Vita is trying to create a whole new business model to help jumpstart a restoration economy. We grow corals to bring dying reefs back to life and then sell the service of reef restoration to all the stakeholders that depend on those values, while also working in turn with local communities that depend on those reefs the most. And so operating our first farm in Freeport, Grand Bahama, and ultimately hope to do this all around the world.
Fantastic. Thank you all. And I think that helps to share, the optimism, but also the diversity of the voices that we have with us today. And with that in mind, I'd actually love to start off, as we think about ocean restoration, I think it is really important to start with a foundation and recognize that it's really integral to consider traditional knowledge as we think about how to approach restoring and managing coastlines in a way that is accessible, but also intentional and respectful of what's been ongoing and of this history of action. And so on that note, Kelsey, I'd love to hear from you a little bit more about your work in that realm and how Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge can inform decision-making around coastal and marine management and protection, and your experience within that world and how that can be best executed.
Thank you for the question. I think first off, traditional ecological knowledge, Indigenous science, it's already being applied by Indigenous nations around the world as it pertains to ocean protection and ocean management and governance within, our own territories and communities. And, when we think about, sometimes folks are a little bit confused or unsure what actually constitutes traditional ecological knowledge or Indigenous science. And it's very similar to other scientific traditions around the world. For us, our activities in coastal areas with, in relation with the ocean is an applied science over thousands of years. So these are practices that we have in lots of ways perfected, over the course of the millennia that we have been existing, since time immemorial in our home communities. So there's just so many breadth of experiences from all different parts of the ocean, whether you're in the Pacific Northwest and thinking about how we are caring for and responding to our orca populations, as well as our first foods like salmon, and the way in which those Indigenous nations on that part of what we call Turtle Island, you may know as North America, what they're doing and really how they are actually being, leaned on by Western scientists to understand some of the restoration and ecosystem rehabilitation practices that they've been implementing, and having to sort of reclaim and revitalize. This is sort of a standard for a lot of us as Indigenous nations and practitioners that are working in ocean protection, is we're having to revitalize, reclaim, reinvigorate a lot of these practices, because colonization for so many decades, if not centuries, has really prevented Indigenous stewardship and practices from being undertaken. And there was really an attempt to try and limit our sovereignty and the exercise of that sovereignty in the practice of our stewardship practices. So, there's so much that's happening, and those are some examples from the West Coast. For me, being, a Eastern Coastal Algonquin Indigenous representative for a tribal nation in the Mid-Atlantic region of what's currently known as the United States, what we saw probably in the past decade or so is a lean in by the U.S. federal government into allowing and providing more opportunities for interjurisdictional coordination with tribes when it comes to ocean partnerships and ocean governance, and thinking about how are we protecting America's coastlines and ocean resources for future generations. And that was a process that started under the Bush administration, went through the Obama administration, and really had us seeing tribal nations have our government to government relationship with the United States of America recognized in such a manner that we were engaged and a part of regional ocean partnerships and really having what we call, or what I call in a lot of my research, is a seat at the table. You know, the world, non-Indigenous folks, non-Indigenous organizations, you know, the broader nation states around the world can't claim to operationalize traditional ecological knowledge or Indigenous science without Indigenous peoples at the table. You know, so it's kind of this mantra that we hear from a lot of our Indigenous nations around the world of nothing about us without us. And I think that that's so applicable in the ocean space right now when we think both about ocean governance, ocean conservation. There are just so many things happening at an international level to the exclusion of Indigenous peoples that it baffles me and blows my mind all the time that these sort of inherited intellectual legacies of colonialism keep happening even in what are supposed to be quote unquote good spaces of conservation and work towards, you know, the climate crisis and addressing some of the issues that we see and challenges that we see for our ocean. But kind of transitioning there just a little bit on some best practices that I've seen.
Yeah.
You know, we're, you know, for the Shinnecock Nation, we've really, like I mentioned earlier, leaned in to our traditional ecological knowledge, doing some nature, what sort of Western science might call nature-based solutions. We we lean into our non-human relations and our and that sort of non-human kin that we've had, you know, for millennia, to say, well, how have we not been caring for the land and caring for the water in the way that we should have? And some of that for us at Shinnecock has been doing coastal habitat restoration, doing eelgrass planting, leaning into—
Oh, hi everyone. Sorry.
Oh, sorry, there's a bit of a sound glitch there. Everyone can still hear me?
All is well. I had the Marketplace for the Future open as well. I've just shut that down, so we should be all set. Sorry. Sorry.
Oh, no worries. So yeah, so we've just been leaning into some of our traditional ecological knowledge on Shinnecock. For those that aren't aware of our nation, we are a coastal nation on the east end of southern shores of Long Island, what we call Tominac. And so our reservation territory literally juts in to Shinnecock Bay, and sort of on the other side of sort of that barrier island of Fire Island is the Atlantic Ocean. So we are really dealing with all of the sort of major ocean concerns that the world is bringing to the forefront right now, because we've been on the front lines of this work for decades as we started to see storm surge, saltwater intrusion, and sea level rise. And so, you know, a paper just came out in Nature this week really saying that even if we do meet the Paris Agreement targets, we're still expected to see at least 2 meters of sea level rise in the next 100 years. And so for us as Shinnecock people, you know, in our language, Shinnecock means people of the stony shore. So we're leaning into some of those nature-based solutions, fortifying our shoreline with those stones that originally were there that we call, you know, that our name comes from, and really trying to think through what does sea level rise mean for our communities and how do we adapt. So thank you.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. And I love what you've shared too, in that a lot of Indigenous knowledge has been repackaged. Sorry for all the background noises here. Has been repackaged or shared in terms of a more modern day Western science perspective and thinking about nature-based solutions. And certainly that's become the framework and terminology within UN spheres and elsewhere. But truly, this is a no-brainer, right? This is just letting nature do its thing. This is just making sure that we can be fostering and allowing for natural ecosystems, whether that's seagrass or coral reefs that would already be protecting storm surge and doing all this incredible work that we have no chance of engineering on our own without having that master plan that nature already had in place. So thank you for drawing that connection. And I'd love to just hear a little bit more from you about, I'm just pulling this up so I don't get the name incorrect, but the Mid-Atlantic Ocean Action Plan. So what is this plan, and what does this mean for people who live along the coast? What does this mean for Indigenous peoples who as you were sharing, also have in many cases lost this land? Or how can we make sure that this plan is bringing all voices to the table?
So I will say that the Mid-Atlantic Ocean Action Plan is a vestige of the previous administration, and particularly the administrations of Bush and Obama, that really charged what were then called the regional planning bodies with creating regional ocean plans that could be a set of priorities particularly for the Mid-Atlantic. Ours were situated around the protection and sort of guidance for I wouldn't really say creation, but the maintenance and the restoration of healthy ocean ecosystems, as well as interjurisdictional coordination for our existing and maybe potential future ocean uses. So that being said, the Ocean Action Plan, it took about four or 5 years to create, and it was completed in December of 2016, and we had a new administration come in. And unfortunately, the Ocean Action Plan has went largely unimplemented under the Trump administration. There have been aspects of it, things related to marine debris, things related to having more data through open data portals that have, continued to be implemented under the work of sort of that transition from regional planning bodies to regional ocean partnerships, and now what we call the Mid-Atlantic Committee on the Ocean. Under the Trump administration, we have sort of seen snippets of the Ocean Action Plan items implemented, but largely the plan has gone unimplemented. So in answering your question, if folks really care about the ocean and really care about these wonderful ocean action plans that were created that had indigenous voices, tribal sovereignty at the table and respected, you need to go out and vote in November. You really need to vote for candidates who are for the ocean and for the future of the ocean, for the future of our communities. And I will leave that decision with you, but we all need to vote. And I have definitely seen how the pendulum swing in administrations has direly affected our ocean governance and policy over the past 4 years.
Yeah, I think a very timely reminder. Certainly top of mind, and thank you for that reminder, and a way that we can all directly take action and feel that we can truly be a part of creating the solution that we need to see. But yeah, thank you so much for that framing, Kelsey. Oh, sorry, go for it. Did you have a?
Yeah, no, I think the only thing I will add there too is I talk a lot about what is our civic duty? What does citizenship mean? I think it also means what does it mean to be a good citizen of the ocean, a good citizen towards the ocean. And I think, that requires us to not only vote, but it requires us to also understand the history of the territories that we now call home, and particularly the existence of indigenous rights within those territories. And I think that that's something, I don't want to just sort of say the Trump administration has failed to implement these ocean action plans. I mean, we as citizens have failed to call to, some form of uprising to protect the ocean, to protect our planet, even though we know that we are in a climate crisis, even though we know that the Paris Agreement targets are not being met. And so I think there's some individual responsibility that we all have to take ownership of. And particularly when we think about the violation of indigenous rights, there is some individual culpability there. The lack of education, the lack of knowledge, the lack of care for fellow human beings who have gone through massive forms of colonization and genocide in what's currently known as North America. And it continues. Right now off of the coast of Digby in Nova Scotia, where I currently am in Canada, Mi'kmaq fishermen are exercising their sovereign rights to fish off of the coast of Digby, and they're under siege. Settlers there have been cutting their fishing lines, attacking their boats. They've been under violent forms of siege and not being able to come back to the shore without having their own Mi'kmaq people putting up a barrier of defense line against these settler fishermen. So, we want to think of colonization as being something that was 500 years ago, 300 years ago, 100 years ago. It's still ongoing. And the exclusive practices that exist within ocean governance and ocean management right now are just really disheartening. And I'm really hoping for change, but that requires individual citizen responsibility, and for folks to be a part of that is to vote.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for the incredibly powerful words, and also sparking a very emotional response. I think what we've been seeing more and more as the movement has been evolving and as this week has been evolving is that we can't think of climate change and the climate crisis that we're facing as purely a scientific issue. It's not something that scientists are concerned around. It's something that humans are concerned about. It's something that impacts humans and people's lives. And this is why we're fighting this fight. It's not to save the planet, but it's actually to save ourselves. And I think integrating that as best that we can, hopefully can remind us to think through those histories and think through the people who are impacted most immediately, but who are also in early indicators of how the rest of us will also feel impacted by this crisis. So yeah, thank you for that. And I think really good to have that framing also of the legislative framework that we need to tackle these issues and how to move forward. With that in mind, I'll pivot to Jason, and I have a few questions for you, but just thinking through how, as you mentioned at the beginning, it's really great to see the ocean and climate in conversation, in the same conversation. And we often see these two fields in silos or not able to work together when really they're so deeply interconnected and interwoven from multiple perspectives. The ocean not only absorbs most of the heat that humans are producing, as well as much of the carbon dioxide that we've been emitting since the Industrial Revolution, but it's also another space where we are seeing those early indicators: increased natural disasters, sea level rise. So we have been seeing some exciting commitments come out of this week, and I'd love to hear more from you about the Ocean Foundation Seagrass Grow Program. But one commitment that I would share is Walmart's commitment within their plan of achieving carbon neutrality or carbon negative operations by 2040 is to restore 1 million square miles of ocean by 2030. And so this makes us really excited, of course, but can you share with us a little bit more about your Seagrass Grow Program and how you've been able to integrate with the private sector in that way too?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. So in 2008, the Ocean Foundation started focusing a lot of our attention, and we actually stood up an internal program within the Ocean Foundation, squarely focused on this idea of blue carbon, which is harnessing what we're talking about, nature-based solutions along these tidal wetlands. So we focus a lot on seagrass, salt marsh, mangroves, and now we've started a pilot projects with kelp and actually repurposing sargassum into organic compost fertilizer. So these blue carbon solutions have incredible potential at helping us achieve our global goals towards carbon reduction, carbon neutrality, all things carbon sequestration. So the reason that we started focusing on seagrass and mangroves, quite frankly, is because the science and the data was there. If you look at IUCN or Smithsonian or the United Nations, even different studies out of the EU, seagrasses sequester, up to 10 times more carbon than a terrestrial forest, and mangroves are 20 or 30 times more effective. And they're less susceptible of being burned down or dying and releasing that carbon back into the atmosphere. They bury that in their soil, and they sequester it for millennia. But then we started investigating and realized that there's actually all of these other co-benefits to bring to this. And that's sort of where the private sector and I think the public sector have a really beautiful opportunity to work together. In addition to sequestering carbon, seagrasses and mangroves are critical to what we refer to as coastal resilience, the ability for a coastline to respond and adapt to the increasing effects that we see sprung on by climate change. So if you have seagrass in the water and you have mangroves along your coastline, you are going to help dissipate wave energy when there's increasing storms, and you're going to help ward off flooding, protecting these coastal communities. They also provide critical fish habitat. So they have a very holistic and beautiful relationship for an ecosystem to thrive, and in some cases just survive. And one of the things we've seen with the private sector is we want to get the biggest bang for our buck. And we know that it is a whole heck of a lot cheaper to invest in these nature-based solutions than build a concrete wall around our coastline. And we have real assets, whether it's the tourism industry, the hospitality industry, or just businesses that understand we have to protect the land in which their property is on. These nature-based solutions have all of these other co-benefits, but they're also more cost-effective than some of the other gray infrastructural or concrete-based solutions that we'd have to embrace otherwise. So we've seen a lot of companies come to the Ocean Foundation and ask for help offsetting their carbon footprint. So one of the services we do is we will calculate your carbon footprint for you. We have a calculator that folks and individuals can use, converts it into tons, and then they can offset that carbon footprint. The project that our flagship project is actually based in Puerto Rico. Because of all these co-benefits I mentioned, we went there in response to Hurricane Maria in 2017 to not only sequester carbon, but also help build coastal resilience. So I think this is something the hospitality industry is keenly aware of, but corporations at large understand we have to reduce our carbon footprint, and this is a key way how.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And thank you so much, Jason, too, for painting that picture for us of how can we marry both the private sector, the public sector, and this work that you're doing on the ground and with communities there. Just for everyone who's joining the session, could you help define for us a little bit what coastal resiliency means and how you did mention this in part, but how is salt marsh, mangrove, seagrass, how are they helping us achieve a state of coastal resiliency?
Yeah, great, thank you. So to give people an idea, because this is always kind of a mind-blowing statistic for me, seagrasses occupy 0.1% of the ocean floor, so 1/10 of 1%, yet they have 11% of all the organic carbon buried in the ocean. So they are remarkably efficient. And through the process of photosynthesis, they are a flowering grass that lives below the water and in the shallow waters in the soil. But one of the great things about them is that as they're sequestering carbon, unless they're disrupted by human disruptants, like people going in with their boats and having their propeller scars, they're sequestering that carbon and storing it in their soil for millennia. Whereas we're a big fan of trees, of terrestrial forests, but when a tree dies, it releases the carbon it has back into the atmosphere. And so that's why blue carbon has these magnifying effects. And then they're also just more powerful at the ability to their carbon storage uptake ability. And so one of the reasons that we're focused on them is because many people talk about the carbon market. So we're here at the marketplace of the future, right? And so the carbon market has basically been treated as a regulatory market. So you have companies who are coming from a regulatory standpoint. They want to be able to pollute a certain amount, or they're being regulated at a certain emission standards. And so they're buying the cheapest carbon credits that they can, that might be biofuel based, and they're not achieving any of these other co-benefits. You also don't know a lot where these projects are. And so one of the big problems that governments around the world is under the Paris Climate Agreement, the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, have a set of standards. And so as companies are choosing these cheaper carbon credits that don't achieve any other value in the ecosystem, they're not helping that country achieve their nationally determined goals, which go to our global goals. So that has really led to a rethinking of the carbon market, and blue carbon is very new. So right now, the only certified carbon projects that actually exist are mangroves. There are no certified seagrass projects in the world. And that is why the Ocean Foundation has focused so much on them, because the methodology does exist, but the expense of third-party certification does not make sense. It's almost twice as much to certify a project than to do it. And so by focusing on these projects, by proving the methodology, showing that this works in a variety of climates and conditions, scaling it throughout regions, making it viable for different financial investors to come in and scale it, we are getting very close to certification, and that's ultimately our goal. is to get seagrasses, salt marsh, kelp, and sargassum online in the carbon market.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. So I'm going to turn over to Sam. And now that we have spoken about, the legislative framework that we need to have in place, our role as citizens of the ocean, and I love that, Kelsey. I think that's fantastic. And from Jason, hearing about how can we play in this marketplace? How can we get the solutions that need to be at the forefront available for investors, for people, genuine community-oriented solutions? So can you share with us more from your perspective about what Coral Vita does? And I really do love your title, Chief Reef Officer. I think it's still the best one I've heard yet. So can you share with us, thinking about that concept and taking that to the next level, how from your perspective also can these ecosystem solutions through ocean restoration come to life in the realm of coral reefs? And can you maybe start by just sharing more about the importance? I know you did briefly, but why do we care about coral reefs? What do they do for us? And why is that an important part of this conversation as we're talking about ocean restoration?
Well, I'll start by saying when you have your own company, you definitely get to make up your own title. So I'm definitely glad I got to choose that one. And I think to start off by answering your question, I'll put a little tie into what both of my fellow presenters sort of touched on as far as why coral reefs matter. And first off, I think it's quite telling that the Hawaiian people's origin story starts with all life emerging from the coral polyp. So the whole tale of how humanity and life on Earth came to be in Hawaiian tradition is told starting with a coral. And when we consider the value of reefs, there's many ways to look at that. But when you're talking about food, you're talking about clothes, you're talking about shelter, you're talking about cultural heritage for up to 1 billion people around the world, from an ecosystem that takes up less than 1% of the entire ocean floor. It's quite telling just how important they are and inspirational. And they also have tons of other values. My life would be much easier if coral had a carbon sequestration value, as I'm sure Jason can attest to. But they also coexist often with seagrass beds and with mangrove forests. And, I last year, our first coral farm is based in Freeport, Grand Bahama, and we were devastated last year by Hurricane Dorian. It was the strongest storm to ever hit the Bahamas. I was there for it. I don't recommend staying for a Category 5 hurricane, but one of the values that coral reefs, as well as mangroves, provide is coastal protection. So as an example, a coral reef, in addition to all the other benefits, can reduce on average wave energy by 97%. And we saw mangroves and coral reefs literally save people's lives. Last year, when they had enough time to get to their neighbor's house or to climb a tree or to get to higher ground. And so this is one ecosystem, coral reefs, provides all of these benefits. 1/4 of all marine life depend on reefs, 1 billion people, as I mentioned before. And then when you think about entire economies that are tied to tourism, that have coastal property and infrastructure that's at risk from sea level rise and increasing storm surges. When we're thinking about COVID-19, there already are drugs on the market for fighting viral infections, cancer, arthritis that are derived from compounds found on coral reefs. We often think about like the Amazon rainforest as a source for all these medicines. I cannot speak at any length about the amount of just traditional medicines that exist that come from nature. That I'm sure Kelsey would be able to speak to more, but there's so much more in the estimates are that there's 300 to 400 times more compounds in coral reefs than in tropical rainforests. So we lose these ecosystems, we're losing heritage, we're losing jobs, we're losing people's ability to live. And it's a massive problem. So that's the scary side of things. The hopeful side, I'd say, is the ability to regenerate and restore. I never thought I was going to be a coral farmer, full stop. I've been a diver my whole life, but it's not what I envisioned for myself. And it's interesting having a job where and in particular, a business where I hope to be put out of business. I wish that there was no reefs left for me to restore. Unfortunately, we're not heading in that direction. And I will be the first one to say that the best thing to do is not to hire a company like Coral Vita, but it is to solve climate change and to end destructive fishing practices and pollution, to stop killing reefs. But we're not doing that fast enough. And I say we, I agree in our power as individuals. As Kelsey alluded to before, I tell people all the time, voting in a democracy is one of the most important things you can do. But in terms of political leaders, business leaders, leaders in media, it's on them to solve those problems. In the meantime, though, we need to rapidly scale up adaptation and resilient solutions. And so that's what coral reef restoration is a way to ensure reefs survive for future generations. They continue providing these benefits until we put the right policies and practices in place to mitigate the damages happening. So I started it while I was in grad school with my friend Gator, which is truly his name. Brothers are Moose and Griffin. So definitely destined to be working on the water. And Gator and I were looking at big environmental problems that weren't being solved at the scale or pace needed to really make a difference. And I previously worked for a small NGO in the country of Mauritius, where we got a small grant from the United Nations to do a coral farm, and I got to see how a reef can come back to life in the right conditions, but that the existing model is largely grant funded. That one project was not an enjoyable experience to go get that UN grant, and it let us grow 5,000 corals once, and then the funding expired. And before the oil spill that hit Mauritius a few weeks ago, they need 5 million corals every year, and that's one country. And so together with a few other ecological limitations, we thought, well, what if looking at the value around reefs, tourism, fisheries, coastal protection, everyone that depends on those benefits, if we can create a mission-driven company that integrates breakthrough science and then gets people to pay to restore the reefs they depend on, that maybe could unlock the funding to go from projects growing thousands of corals to projects that are growing hundreds of thousands and millions and ultimately billions of corals, that we have a self-sustaining restoration economy that can keep these ecosystems alive and hopefully will spur similar innovations in mangroves and seagrasses and less tropical coastal ecosystems as well. And so, yeah, we raised a private investment round to launch our first farm in Freeport, Grand Bahama. And we did that last year. Things were going great before Hurricane Dorian. The fall was all kind of a humanitarian effort for local communities. And then we finally got the farm up and running in March, just in time for COVID. But we are still doing our work. The government gave us exemption to keep operating. And our ultimate vision is to launch these farms in countries all around the world, working with the private sector, governments, local communities, scientists, you name it, because it's a team effort to really do this. And I guess the last thing I'll also mention is as far as how we're trying to generate the revenue in addition to selling restoration as a service, because I appreciate this is more of a novel approach that people might not know about, is that the farms where we grow the corals are on land. So it's like an aquaculture facility. And so we're pumping clean seawater through tanks. We're working with coral species that are native to the areas we're working in. They live in our tanks. We use methods to strengthen the resiliency to warming and acidifying oceans. So as an example, we can look at future predictions for temperature, and it's almost like taking the corals to the gym. We can sort of gradually bring up the temperature, bring it back down, stress test the corals so that when we outplant them, they survive better. We also have methods known as microfragmenting, where corals can be grown up to 50 times faster. So months instead of decades, which greatly increases species diversity. All this is happening on land. So we decided as we grow the corals to restore the reefs and work on these longer term contracts to do restoration, we'd also turn the farms themselves into ecotourism attractions so that people can come visit our farm if they're in the Bahamas, learn what we're doing, hopefully get excited about it. They can adopt corals, plant them with our team, and that can unlock more funding for it. And then the last piece I'll mention also, bringing it back to sort of the initial part of the conversation, is ultimately these reefs matter most for the communities who depend on them. And so our farms also act as education centers for local students. We want to employ locals as much as possible because these reefs matter most for them. And using it as an opportunity to really help, I think, on the education front as much, because as I said before, the best thing to do for reefs is stop killing them. So if people really appreciate the opportunity and that's afforded by healthy ecosystems and have a stake in their health, I think that there's an opportunity really to then do what's necessary to protect these corals in the first place and other ecosystems as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Sam. And I think what you've highlighted was actually going to be my second question. So I'm really glad that you mentioned it. Another component of this ocean climate nexus is that as the ocean is warming, corals are bleaching, and that's just another stressor on top of everything else that we've been highlighting. And so it's exciting to see that you can take the corals to the gym, get them to exercise their thermally resistant natures, or figure out which strains are more thermally resistant and be microfragmenting those pieces and getting those out there. And I also love what you mentioned too about youth and education. And I think we see this across sectors, but especially in the ocean sector, because it is, I do recognize how much of a privilege it is to be able to go underwater and to see what's going on down there. And so, generally when you give somebody a snorkel mask, you can totally change their lives and see how that impacts the way that they now realize what's beneath the waves, quite literally, what is there, and how vibrant that ecosystem is, and recognize the reliance, even though it may be completely subsistence reliance. It's easier to see that with the visual. So cool to have the farms above ground where that's easy for all to see.
For sure.
Yeah.
It's remarkable that this type of work is needed by any of us, but it's also, I think, in recognition that that's what we got to do. And I do like to describe myself as an optimistic realist. There's a lot of bad things that exist in the world, but that there also are reasons for hope and to take action to improve things and collaborate with others and to sort of regenerate ourselves, as well as the communities and ecosystems that are all interlinked. So it's a privilege to be with everyone else on this panel and considering these things, because it's a lot of different angles that we need to approach things from. So it's great to have all these perspectives together.
Absolutely. And that's a perfect segue actually to my next question for all the panelists, to open it up to all of you all. What makes you optimistic? What is it that keeps you going, and how come you haven't thrown in the towel? What is it that keeps you excited and and continuing in this journey? And hopefully how can we inspire others to get involved in that sense too?
I guess just since I talked about Dorian, I'll just roll first. I mean, not to sort of make this a sob story, but Hurricane Dorian, COVID, there's actually a disease that's broken out also underwater. There's corals that are dying from another thing in the Bahamas. We've had a plane crash. So there's been many tests and personal resilience along the way. But I mean, there's a picture of a much younger, chubbier me wearing a shirt that says failure is not an option. And as silly as that sounds, it just was like, it is a sort of, what's the alternative? Like, I can't imagine a world without coral reefs. We're heading in that direction. But I also can't imagine a world where hundreds of millions of people, many of whom have lived off these reefs for centuries and millennia, whose entire identities are formed from them, being displaced, and what the world's going to look like if all those people are on the move, and often might not be able to move, as biodiversity is collapsing. So it's might be rooted in a sort of a more powerfully dark reality, but ensuring that reality doesn't come to be is a huge driving factor in what I do. And my parents raised me on a principle in Jewish tradition called Tikkun HaOlam, which is repair of the world. And so just my whole life, I've had that sort of spirit imbued into the things that I do. And I'm always able to sort of rely on that together with my family and the people that I work with, especially in the communities that I work with, to just keep moving forward, because that's the way.
Amazing. Yeah. Thank you for those inspiring words, Sam. Jason, Kelsey, any thoughts on optimism?
Sure. Yeah. So, you a few years ago, the IPCC report comes out, and, if you follow Bill McKibben and other folks, and you look at how we've exceeded the parts per million, right? There's a lot of things. And then, if you listen to everything that Sam talks about, there's a lot that you're like, wow, okay, this is heavy, right? And maybe it's too late. Like, maybe it really is too late. Like, we should all just invest in SpaceX and, go to Mars. But then there are certain, I think, just unintentional things that happen when you are doing this work, when you're in this space, it's like things just sort of happen to you that you just get lucky, and it kind of rejuvenates you. And so a quick example that I'll share is, so we have this project in Puerto Rico, but also in February this year, right before the pandemic really escalated and things got shut down, there was a set of funder meetings that all occurred in Puerto Rico. So the Clinton Global Initiative, Confluence Philanthropy, Environmental Grant Makers Association, like all of these different funding meetings all occurred in the same week in Puerto Rico, because it was like, if we're going to fund these communities, we should probably know these communities. And I was there, and one of the other funders said, I'm going to Vieques, which is part of Puerto Rico, but it's an island, small island, about 20 miles off the mainland coast of Puerto Rico. Yeah, I'm going there for a weekend to visit this local partner. Would you like to come? And so I did. I got on the ferry and I went over. And Vieques was actually a Navy like bomb testing facility where they used to just bomb the island for years. And a group of activists went in, 20, 30 years ago, and basically got the Navy out. And that group, then a lot of those leaders started the Vieques Conservation and Historical Trust. And they're a community organization, they're a conservation organization. They also manage something called Mosquito Bay. Mosquito Bay is known as the brightest bioluminescent bay in the world. So there's only like 80 something bioluminescent bays in the world. 3 of them are in Puerto Rico, and this one is supposedly the brightest in the world. So I had the privilege of going out in this canoe at night under stars. And with bioluminescence, what happens is there's this organism called dinoflagellates, which when friction happens, it creates this neon glow in the water. So if you put your hand in, or we saw sharks swimming, it creates this vibrant neo glow, and it's breathtaking. It's honestly breathtaking. The whole island's livelihood, scientific research, it all depends on this. And when Hurricane Maria hit, it eroded the mouth of the bay, which was mangroves. And that mouth of the bay is basically what keeps the whole thing in balance. It maintains the perfect salinity from the salt water of the ocean coming in and out, and it maintains the perfect water quality and protects the dinoflagellates from seeping out of the bay. And because that was damaged and no one had intervened, if we had allowed maybe 6 months or a year to go, they probably would have lost the dinoflagellates and that bay would have gone dark. So the brightest bay in the world gone dark. And so we heard about this and we're like, oh my God, we have to act. And so when we came back, we just put out a plea to funders, private foundations, individuals, and they funded the project that basically the Ocean Foundation just redirected the money to this trust that is doing the work. And right now, even in pandemic, they're intervening to restore the mangroves and they're going to save this bay. And so I think you can't reverse the millions, the parts per millions in the atmosphere. Like you can't do that overnight, and you can't sequester all the carbon we need overnight. But I think if you say, okay, what can I do in my space of the world, one project at a time, one day at a time, I think that's what gives me hope. Is now this is a real tangible thing where people's lives will be better because this bay is in existence. And it wasn't something that we came up with and said, aha, we found the solution. It was, we used our ability in the philanthropic world to leverage investment, to have the people in this community do what they do best. And they intervened. And now that bay is going to be saved. And so I think it's those those little victories to me that kind of keep it going. Because when you add all of those little victories up, they're pretty big. So that's what gives me hope.
That's a beautiful story. And thank you so much, Jason, also for reminding us of the awe and the beauty of the ocean. And yeah, it's so important to have that perspective as well. But that's wonderful. I will do a quick call out as we head over to Kelsey for this question too. But if you do have questions in the audience, feel free to drop them in the Q&A. And if you're unable to find the Q&A, you can just drop the questions in the chat as well, so we can be sourcing those and hearing your questions as well. But Kelsey, what gives you optimism?
Well, I think first it's, if we if we really start to rethink for a lot of folks out there in the world, your relationship to the ocean. Um, if if you see the ocean only as a resource for human benefit and human use, then that creates a lot of hopelessness. That's kind of doing the opposite. And so I think, what I tap into is, through our Shinnecock tradition, but through also like other indigenous philosophies, is that the ocean is alive, it's living, it sustains life for so many other species outside of human beings. And if you view the ocean as a relative and as someone and an entity that's living, then you don't just give up on your grandfather, right? You don't just give up on a relative when they are hurting and in need of healing. You're there to support that, that person through their time of hardship. And I think that's where we all need to find more of that restoration of connection. We talk a lot about restoring the ocean, but we need to also restore our own connection to the ocean. And I think that can provide a lot of hope. And for myself, it's, that connection is foundational to our understandings of who we are as Shinnecock people. Ocean protection and sort of the hope for the ocean stems from the fact that we are the people of the Stony Shore. For thousands of years, that's who we've been and will continue to be for another 1,000 more if we're lucky. And in saying that, we cease to exist when the ocean ceases to exist. And that can be very daunting, but it also can be very inspiring and hopeful and give you a sense of resiliency past your own lifetime on this planet, which is really what we are in need of, is for us to think outside of our own human existence and temporary existence on this planet, and think longer, and think about those future generations as well as past generations, learn from that history and be able to do better. So thanks.
I love what you're saying too about restoring our connection to the ocean and just feeling a part of something that's greater. Ideally, we can be white blood cells for the planet rather than parasites as we have been behaving. But we absolutely have that capacity. We have the compassion, the awareness, the self-awareness, ideally, to do and to be that. And so thank you for that reminder, because I think we do have a broken relationship with our ocean and with our planet more broadly. But yeah, starting with the heart is a great place to start. So I'm just looking at the timing. I think we're wrapping up our panel now. So I just want to ask one last question, and then to encourage our panelists just to write in the chat as we're wrapping up here, how people can get in touch, what websites are best, or how can people stay connected following. But the final question for all of you is, what final note would you like to leave our audience here with today? I think we've been talking about some actions, but what is one thing each of us can do today at home during quarantine for our ocean, for restoring that relationship, or for restoring the health of our ocean?
Well, I mean, I think I'll just say that I think Kelsey put it perfectly when she said vote. I mean, we are, 40-something days away from an election, a very consequential election. So I would echo civic engagement is paramount. The other thing that I would say that I think is goes in line with what everyone else is saying is do something to connect with the ocean. I think sometimes it's very hard, right? I think it's easier to go for a walk. You can go for a walk almost anywhere. There's parks everywhere, even in like a city like Manhattan, you can find a park. But it's harder to get to the ocean. And so I think the best way to build supporters is to build people who have proximity and interaction with the ocean whenever they can. And so I think to remember the beauty of the ocean, to maybe find a time during quarantine to sneak away with your family or friends and just marvel at the beauty and remember what's important about it.
Fantastic. Oh, that was perfect. Thank you so much for that, Jason. Any thoughts on final notes or actions, Kelsey and Sam?
Yeah, we're just kind of tossing it back and forth there. I would say, one of the major things I'm concerned with right now, given the pandemic, is our use of single-use plastics. We have a lot of, of needed PPE materials that have been really needed to protect, protect our health and protect, humanity. But a lot of those materials, gloves, face masks are ending up in our ocean, and we have massive issues with marine debris. And all of the good work that we can do towards habitat restoration and carbon sequestration, that goes out the window if we are just continuing to throw our trash and treat the ocean like a big trash bin, as opposed to a relative or to a human being that's deserving of respect and care and responsibility. So that would be my biggest thing. Is you might be stuck at home, you might be dealing with a pandemic, but really be conscious about your use. In addition to voting, be conscious about your use of single-use plastics and really trying to cut down, especially on the waste and disposal of those plastics, so that they're not going into our ocean.
Thank you so much for perfectly setting that up. I really appreciate 100% agree with you. I think that is so important, and we're seeing the impacts of that right now in COVID response. I just shot in the chat, Oceanic Global has actually been working on COVID plastic-free reopening guidelines for restaurants and hotels, and then we created an edition for events and for sports, but a lot of that is relevant to anybody, to us as individuals, to our families, to our homes. We did a lot of research on how the virus does spread, how it can be stopped and contained, and how we can be still using reusable materials, reusable face masks in a safe way. And part of that too is highlighting that even with wearing gloves, it gives you this false sense of security that you then actually touch more things than you would if you're focusing on sanitizing your hands or washing your hands more often. So there's a couple of tips and tricks there, but yeah, thank you for that, Kelsey. I think that's fantastic.
So I'm actually going to say three things real quick. One, shout out to Cassia and Oceanic for what they're doing. Thanks for moderating this panel. And Oceanic does do great work, so I encourage people to check them out. The second, I did just see a Q&A came up from me, so I'm just going to hit real quick, and then I'll end on what people can do from home. So someone's asking, what are some of the challenges that Coral Vita for Caesars is dealing with in terms of expanding on a bigger scale? There's many ways I could answer that, but I'd say education. And as an example, we've had hotel owners that are like, this is a no-brainer. Of course, we'd want to restore a reef so that snorkel and scuba tourists will still come to our hotel. And we've had hotel owners show up in $1,000 Italian loafers on the beach, not understanding what we're talking about or how a coral reef matters to them. So the education piece, getting people to understand on so many levels the value of nature, but given the world and system we live in, the economic value of reefs, and using that as a motivating force to get people to care more. We're moving in the right direction, but in terms of scaling, that does require education, which most times a business doesn't have to. I mean, there's some marketing and tricks and stuff like that, but it's a much more longer term effort. And that, I think, goes back to what people can do from home is education, and also, to echo everyone else, vote. If you're in a democracy, let alone the US, it is the thing, full stop. But there's lots of resources online, and I think especially if you reach out to people, be curious and ask questions. Don't be afraid to not know something, and sort of put yourself out there. There's great documentaries in my space. Chasing Coral is on Netflix. I think it might be for free on YouTube at this point. But there's just, there's documentaries, there's webinars, there's things that are in bite-sized 30-second nuggets, as well as, full feature-length films. But the more we educate ourselves and then are able to share that with more people, it grows. It gets that connection to the ocean, the restoration of ourselves with the ocean, much more involved. So we're all on our computers right now. I challenge people to just find a little thing, take 2 minutes, learn something, and maybe you'll find something you love about the ocean, and then share it with a friend or a loved one, because that's how we're all going to sort of collaborate on this together, is sharing with one another.
Amazing. Thank you all so much for that. And I think the only thing that I would add to that, which has been alluded to throughout the discussion too, is just to learn what's going on in your own communities. So absolutely vote in these larger elections, but also learn about what's going on in your city, in your state, or whatever is relevant for your local space, just to hear about the actions that are ongoing and how you can support, whether it's as small as signing a petition or if it's actually joining a community effort and something that you really care about, and learning about how you can help defend and be advocates, be citizens of the ocean. I really do love that, Kelsey. So yeah, to see how you can support these ongoing efforts and efforts that have been ongoing for generations, and how you can add your energy to that. I think learning is something that we can all do and continue to do. I'm certainly learning every day about this issue and how we can take action. And look to many of the resources that Sam has shared. There's also a website called Investable Oceans that has a list of books and films that are really great resources, and I know that they're continuing to add to that. I will also share one thing specifically that is giving me more optimism and really nourished and filled my heart this Climate Week. But one of our scientific advisors, Ayanna Johnson, alongside Catherine Wilkinson, just released this book, All We Can Save, which is a compilation of essays and poems from female writers all around how we can tackle our climate crisis. And many of them are stories of hope and optimism, and are truly beautiful odes to our relationship to our planet. Reminding us that we are a part of this living being, living organism, and we have a role to play. So yeah, so thank you all three of you for joining us and for being a part of this really productive and inspirational conversation. And thanks to all of you in the audience and those who listen to the recording in the future for tuning in.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks all.
You guys will come down and plant some corals with us one day.
Yes.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Awesome. Amazing. And back to the marketplace of the future leads, but thanks all and take care.